So, it's been a little while. Don't worry, I'm not dead, and I'm still working on Project Concordia. In fact, I'm working so hard that I've totally derailed from my existing plans and began hyper-focusing on a singular, frivolous aspect of the project, which we'll touch on later. For those who don't remember, last thing we added to the project was a mechanic designed to preview the level and visually provide information on upcoming enemies. This ended up becoming the planning phase, which led to us splitting the core gameplay loop into a series of discrete phases: the planning phase, the combat phase, and the cooldown phase. With our current setup, these phases are linear. Planning leads to combat, leads to cooldown. However, what happens if a player dies? Do you reset at planning? This could be tiresome, forcing the player to swap between phase states a potentially great amount of time, incurring a larger input footprint, and potentially visual issues as the planning phase and combat phase would have a distinct style. How about the combat phase? Resetting here makes sense, but then would require the player to quit out of the level entirely if their planned route turns out to be less than adequate for the level they're attempting. It might seem a bit laborious to spell it out, but the solution I found most appropriate was to establish a dead state rather than a dead phase, which allows the player to return to either the planning or combat phase. As is becoming almost tradition in these devlogs, before we jump straight into developing the code, we'll be looking at improving the visuals of our prototype and establishing design rules we'll reuse later down the line. This time, we'll be returning to the character art. One thing I realized about my current implementation is that using the systems we've already got in place, an enemy holding a weapon swaps to a particular enemy sprite, which could theoretically be changed to different sprites based on weapon through scriptable objects or some kind of pre-made sprite list. However, this would require a lot more bespoke art if I wanted more variety in what enemies the player will encounter. While there is nothing inherently wrong with laying down hundreds of clones of a singular henchman, variety has always been the spice of life. My new approach to this conundrum is to turn our characters into skeletal rigs, which can be posed for multiple weapons, while costing way less in terms of bespoke art for individual poses. If you've played a 2D game in the past, it's likely you've seen this kind of approach to animating before, and the secondary benefit of using this style of character posing is that we can use procedural animations for attacks rather than relying on frame animations for things like punching. I tried sketching out a couple variations of top-down bodies in different poses, and ended up creating a master body of sorts that I'd use the dimensions of going forward. This body is separated into 8 sprites: the head, the body, and 2 of the hands, lower arms, and upper arm segments, which can in theory be rotated however we need to achieve whatever poses we need. After navigating Unity's mildly obtuse 2D skinning editor, I imported in all my sketches as sprites, and started posing my character accordingly. Using the animator to alternate between them, I assigned a pose ID to every weapon, and equipping said weapon updates the animator and tells it to transition to a new pose. These poses originally had a transition time, which I tried reducing to feel snappier, but odd rotations and Euler overflows led to me just making the transition instantaneous anyway. This could change in the future, but currently this actually feels better to my eye for what's intended to be a fairly fast-paced game. The beauty in implementing it this way really came to light when I went ahead and added this rig to the enemy prefab, which ended up using the same animator as well. By simply adjusting the code to pass in the same ID to the animator, I got enemy poses set up super quick. There's still obviously more work to be done here, particularly when it comes to their downed poses, which is still sprite-based, but I think this is a decent amount of progress for now, and opens up opportunities to add simple animations going forward. One thing I'll mention before moving on to the main event of this devlog is that I went ahead and added some more functionality to enemies, having them drop their equipped weapon on the floor when knocked down. I went with a slightly more jury-rigged approach by reusing code for thrown equippables, which already places an item on the ground that can be retrieved, and by making it pass through enemies rather than knocking them down, it worked a treat. Enemies don't currently try and retrieve their weapons, and instead revert to an unarmed state, which I've also given to the player by default, so rather than being completely helpless, both players and enemies can strike with the weakest form attack possible: fists. Alright, now that you're all caught up, let's get on to the core goal of this devlog: death. Not literally obviously, but clearly a big part of this game is dying. Stakes are what makes it interesting, because if that energy meter hits 0 and you keep trucking along, there wouldn't be much of an impact to it. The easiest part about all of this is simply identifying when the player is dead. Our energy meter is already rigged up to run when the combat phase is active, so now all we need to do is just check when the energy hits 0 and tell our handy game manager to reset the scene. Yeah, if only it were that easy. In my last game, Dial In, this is actually more or less how I did this. Every level was built in an individual Unity scene and loaded accordingly. When the player died or reset the level, it'd just reload the Unity scene, placing everything back to its initial state. This could work for our purposes, but it's slightly more complex, as it would require passing information between loads of the scene to maintain the planned route, as well as a bypass to go straight to the combat phase. Most importantly though, is that this setup just isn't instantaneous, and takes a second to actually reload the scene, which can put a damper on the flow of the game. The approach I'll be taking this time is to individually reset every object in the scene to its initial state, while maintaining everything else. This would avoid unnecessarily running costly setups for the entities, and should feel instantaneous for the player. Small problem though, I've set up none of the existing components to be reset. If it wasn't clear by now, this part of the devlog isn't about death as a mechanic, but rather death as a thing I endured trying to set this up. Every time I'd run the code, I'd find a new aspect of the enemy script that just hadn't reset properly. To give you a short rundown of what's needed to be done here, just enemies need to reset to their starting position in rotation, reset their patrol back to its initial state, return to their initial state, forget the player's location if they've spotted them, come back to life if they've died, stand up again if they were knocked down during the reset, and re-equip any dropped weapons. Most of these sound incredibly easy, I'm sure. If you write good, clean code, I'm sure writing up something like this would be quick, but what part of this devlog series told you I write good, clean code? The good news is that doing this forced me to clean up a lot of my spaghetti code I'd already written, but not without a much bigger time investment than I intended, and because I went through the effort of having enemies ignore the player once they die rather than assaulting a corpse, I managed to put myself on a several hour-long journey to find out why reset enemies couldn't see. The only good part of this story is that actually identifying where the enemies are was easy, as we already had a complete list of references stored in the game manager, which just went through the list running the reset function. I did eventually get enemies to reset correctly, and from there, what remained was both easier and more complex at the same time. For example, resetting the player character was simple, and led to me further cleaning up the game manager's ability to call functions for it. It simply needed to track where it was when the scene is loaded and return it there while simultaneously unarming it. The second layer of complexity really came from everything else that's dynamic in the game so far. I currently have no nice way of gathering a list of references to equipables on the ground and environmental props. In the future, I'd like to record this information during setup, but without having a weird two-way relationship between game manager and props, my current setup forced me to just use a simple find function. This isn't inherently bad, especially since it's being called so sparingly, but enough years of beginner Unity tutorials struck the fear of God into me, and so I'll undoubtedly be changing this in the future. Once I had this list in hand, and with a bit of cleaning on the individual code side, getting the environmental props to reset was a breeze. And resetting the equipables was only barely an inconvenience, as they were all tracking individual ammo counts on top of their start positions among other things. Last thing to do here was add in a way to reset the combat phase and a way to reset the planning phase, which I bound to R and T respectively. A keen eye will have noted that I called them retry and reset on the death screen rather than both having the same name. This actually ended up being the easiest part of implementing this, as the game manager only needed to load the inputs for the planning phase while unloading the inputs for the combat phase, then quickly swap UIs. Just like that, we've added mortality to our player's world. Hooray! Now, some of you might be wondering, what was the frivolous aspect I was working on that delayed this devlog? Well, that'd actually tie into that find function I mentioned earlier. For Project Concordia to avoid the pitfalls of a scene-based loading system and the frustrations of working in the Unity editor, as well as solving our find object issue, I started working on a level editor. Something I've never done before, but it's certainly been a learning experience. However, I'll save the full details of that for our next devlog. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this devlog, I'd appreciate it if you left a like. And if learning about my completely deranged level editor or Project Concordia in general interests you, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications to be alerted when the next devlog comes out.